Hey guys, it's chapter 25, the Cold War America, 1945 to 1963. We'll look at the Cold War, actually look at two conferences before the Cold War officially began, so right before World War II ended. We'll look at some of the laws that the United States tried to put with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and then we'll start going all across the US, starting with Germany. We'll move on to China, a couple other places in Asia, go to Iran, the Middle East, then Guatemala. We'll continue with Cuba, Israel, Egypt, and then we'll also look at the Cold War here at home. So here's our world map again. We're going to be going all across the world one more time. You could forget about isolationism. The United States never becomes an isolated country after World War II. Let's start in Ukraine, in a little city called Yalta, and what becomes known as the Yalta Conference, February 1945. Remember, World War II officially ends in August 1945, so this is 6 months before the war ends. We have the big three over here, Churchill on the left, Roosevelt on the middle, and Stalin on the right. So at this conference, these three gentlemen met, and they were talking about plans after the war. Stalin, who was a communist in himself, and Russia was a communist country, had pledged to hold free and unfettered elections in Eastern Europe at a future time when the war ended. That was a major promise. In the sense, he was allowing for democracy to take place, which is not what communist countries do. We'll see how he goes back in his word. The big three also agree that Germany was going to be divided into 4 administrative zones. Each country was going to be controlled by the 4 Allied powers. France had one part of Germany. Britain had another part of Germany. The United States had another part of Germany. And the 4th part was going to be controlled by the Soviet Union. The 3 countries also agreed to establish a new international peace organization and what becomes known as the United Nations. And within the United Nations, there was going to be 2 committees. First of all, the General Assembly. One person was going to be representing in the country. And then a Security Council who's going to be taking issues about security. So that was the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Let's come up over here to Germany. Look at another conference that took place 5 months after in what becomes known as the Potsdam Conference. Notice we have a different individual here. This is Harry Truman, because Roosevelt had died at that point. We still have Churchill and we still have Stalin. So only 5 months after Stalin had agreed that he was going to allow for free elections to take place in Eastern Europe, he actually goes back in his word, and this political cartoon kind of shows you that. So this is Joseph Stalin depicted in a political cartoon, and notice he is establishing the Russian flag among the eastern countries, including Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and part of Finland as well. The reason he did that was because he was establishing what he called a buffer zone. What happened was Germany had invaded the Soviet Union twice during World War I and World War II. So Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone so that if Germany tries to invade the Soviet Union a third time, they'll have enough time to be able to prepare for war. At the end of the war, Stalin wanted to punish Germany with reparations, that is, economic sanctions that Germany needed to pay to the Soviet Union. However, learning their lesson from World War I, the Americans and the other allies did not want to punish Germany severely. Instead, they wanted to build Germany's economy because they believed that the recovery of Western Europe depended on a strong German economy. And by doing so, then democracy was spread throughout Europe. And remember, that's what the Cold War is. The Cold War is a conflict over democracy and communism, which type of government should rule and which one is better. Because Stalin created this buffer zone here, basically what Churchill does, he creates a speech, he does a speech where he calls this area the Iron Curtain. And so that's what it becomes known from that point on, the Iron Curtain. Let's go back a little bit now and talk about Greece and Turkey. So since the Allied powers saw that communism was spreading in Eastern Europe, in February 1946, George Kennan proposed, he's from the United States, he proposed that a containment policy should be applied to Soviet expansion. In other words, prevent Russia from expanding any further. And in Greece and in Turkey, there were communists who were seeking to control the country over. So we start seeing that communism was not limited to Eastern Europe, but rather other countries were also fighting communist sympathizers and communists to try to spread communism throughout the world. Making matters worse, on February 1947, Britain, who had been giving economic aid to Greece, told the United States that they would no longer be able to provide economic aid to Greece to fight off communism. So we have the Truman Doctrine. President Truman, on March 1947, he takes over what Britain was doing. He provides economic aid to Greece and Turkey to fight off communism. That is the Truman Doctrine. It is applied only to Greece and Turkey, again, to fight off communism. We start seeing that after World War II, the major powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, are fighting over what is the best form of government. Let's go back a little bit over here to Germany and talk about how this is how Germany looks like today. However, after World War II, Germany was divided into these 4 zones that we were just talking about. So East Germany, obviously is over here. West Germany is on the left-hand side. The green is controlled by Britain. The orange is controlled by France. And the pink is controlled by the United States. Now, not only was the country of Germany divided, but the capital, that is Berlin, which is the insert map here, the capital was also divided among the 4 Allied powers. So the West Berlin was controlled by the United States, France, and Britain, and the East Berlin was divided by the Soviet Union. That creates a conflict. Well, because again, the whole idea that communism could spread, we have another economic plan here. It's called the Marshall Plan. This was the United States promising $13 billion to aid Western Europe to recover from the war. In addition to that, the Allied powers, France, Britain, and the United States, consolidated West Germany into one country, and they established the Republic of Germany in 1949 with its own government. So we see that there is some form of democracy, some form of different ideologies that are spreading, and people in East Germany, which is controlled by Russia, began to flee to West Berlin, because West Berlin is controlled by the Allies. In West Berlin, you have freedoms. In East Germany, you don't. To prevent any people from fleeing to West Berlin, Stalin established a blockade around West Berlin in June 1948. The response by the Allies was the Berlin Airlift. In essence, they established they provided 2.5 million tons of food and supplies to West Berliners. And by May 1949, only about a year after Stalin established the blockade, he actually lifts the blockade. And this map is going to help us understand that a little bit more. So on the left-hand side, again, we have all this is controlled by the Allies. The red is controlled by the Soviet Union. Berlin is right there. West Berlin is also controlled by the Allies. So since Stalin doesn't want people to flee to West Berlin because they have democracy there, he established a blockade. He blocks all these roads that lead to Berlin. So as a response, the Allies use airplanes to fly over Berlin and drop off all these goods. And you see an expecting crowd here waiting for their goods to be shipped by the Americans. So the Americans, along with the French and the British, are starting to see as the good guys, and West Berlin becomes the symbol of communist, trying to prevent communism from spreading. But Berlin and Germany was just a micro aspect of what was going on in the world aspect. Here is a map. So since we have a fight over communism and democracy, countries around the world start to take teams. So in this map, we have color codes. So the green represents NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a military alliance initially of 12 countries. The green ones that you see here are part of the original 12 countries to defend themselves. And NATO said that an attack on one country would be considered an attack on all the countries of NATO. And as such, NATO will retaliate. Well, the Soviet Union and its allies responded by establishing the Warsaw Pact. Again, it was a military alliance, but this was from communist countries, which is in this light purple color. So you see the USSR, Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, some of the countries that joined the Warsaw Pact. And so what we have here is a conflict between NATO and Warsaw. Notice this chart. It tells you in 1945, this is a chart that establishes worldwide nuclear stockpiles. In 1945, the United States had 2 nuclear stockpiles. The Soviet Union had none. Only 10 years later, the United States had over 3,000. The Soviet Union had over 200. 10 years after that, the United States had over 32,000. The Soviet Union had over 6,000. And then things began to de-escalate. So when they were trying to outdo each other in terms of how many weapons each country had, this becomes known as the arm race, the nuclear arm race. So the world by 1950 is at the brink of war over the idea of communism and democracy. Let's look at Asia now. We'll look at China first. So, in the 1930s, the Chinese had been fighting each other because there was a Chinese Civil War. When Japan invaded China, then the two sides actually came together to fight off the Japanese. After the war ended and Japan was ousted out of China, the Civil War re-emerged. The war was between communist leader by Mao Zedong against nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek. Now, the United States sided with Chiang Kai, and they provided him over $2 billion in aid to help the nationalists defeat the communist country. The problem is that Chiang Kai became a very ruthless and corrupt leader. The money that the United States was giving him so that he could provide to the people and help them become more of a democratic country, he was actually keeping for himself. And as such, the people that he was supposed to be protecting actually turned against him. So, since he does not have the help of the people in China, a lot of them turned communism. And by October 1st, 1949, the People's Republic of China was established with Mao as a leader. And Truman was blamed for losing China and would become known as Red China. So on the pictures here on the left-hand side, you see communist forces who are cheering for Mao. Mao is the guy in the middle here. He is the leader of communist China and stays as leader for several decades. And what we see here now, this map, is the Soviet Union was the first country to adopt communism in 1917. After World War II, the Eastern European countries are influenced by Stalin, and so the Eastern European countries also become communist. But now we have all this land here, which is China, that also just became a communist country in an instant in 1949. So 25% of the world's population resided in China. So the fact that the Chinese became communist and in essence defeated in part the United States was a huge blow to the battle over containment. Communism had spread. It had not been contained in China. Next country we're going to be looking at is a little country right here. Next to Japan, this peninsula is the Korean Peninsula. So let's look at Korea as well. So after the war ended, North Korea actually surrendered to China, because remember, China was part of the allies of the United States. South Korea surrendered to Britain. Well, by 1950, South Korea was controlled by the US. North Korea was controlled by Kim Il-sung, and he had the support of the Soviet Union and Stalin. So Kim Il-sung, he convinced Stalin to support him. So on June 25, 1950, the North Korean forces, as you see on this map, they started attacking and they started pushing back South Korea to spread communism and to unite Korea as one country, not divided in between North and South Korea. Well, the United States responds. General Douglas MacArthur on September 14, 1950, he launches a surprise amphibious assault in Incheon, and he's able to push back the North Koreans all the way back to near China, the Yalu River. And that was his mistake. He pushed too far. The Chinese became afraid that after the Americans defeated the North Koreans, that they were going to then attack China, because China had just fallen into communism a year before. So the Chinese now support the North Koreans, and they start pushing back. These forces start pushing back by November 1950. Well, after 3 years of fighting, the war ends with a stalemate along what becomes the 38th parallel. You notice here, that's the 38th parallel, that's the 38th parallel, that's the 38th parallel. That line, as you see here, it was the border between North and South Korea before the war started. 3 years later, after tens of thousands of people have died and the United States has spent a lot of money on it, the 38th parallel continued to divide North and South Korea. And a lot of Americans are upset because a lot of their sons, fathers, friends died in the war for nothing, because the war stayed the same. So that was North Korea. And then we'll finish it up with Vietnam. So Vietnam was a province of France before the war. After the war ended, France wanted to reclaim that land. And Eisenhower supported the French to prevent a domino effect. Eisenhower was afraid that if one country fell to communism, that other countries will fall as well. And that becomes known as a domino effect. By 1954, the Vietnamese forces defeat France. And in that same year, they established the Geneva Conference, which they agreed to divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel between North and South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh becomes the leader of North Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Diem becomes the leader of South Vietnam. And in 1956, Eisenhower deemed $20 million and 675 military advisors to prevent North Vietnam from taking over South Vietnam. And again, we see the conflict between communism and democracy spreading worldwide.